Is it gonna be like streamed, Hendrix?
Hendrik?
Hendrik,
We are?
perfect.
Cool.
Maybe I can share. Where are we streaming it? Welcome to the Code Rabbit live stream. Today I have two great guests joining us for this conversation. And today's conversation, just to get started, is about open models and the models that people are sleeping on. So most of the people who are probably interacting with AI nowadays know about like Anthropic and OpenAI. But there's so much more out there that is coming out. I think there was a time in November, December where we were having probably like a new model every week, not to say more than one model every week. So it become very, very hard to separate noise from signal. And of course, like these big model labs like OpenAI and Anthropic have a good distribution. So they get a lot of these news. And the idea of today's conversation is to talk to the audience about like these other models that are coming out, things that they need to keep their eyes on, things that they need to follow up on, and see what are the best use cases for each of these models. So today I have Irfan. Do you wanna introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Irfan. I'm a I'm a CodeRabbit, Applied AI. I have some background in research, and I'm excited to share my findings with everybody.
Cool. And a special guest, an external guest, Yash, coming back to the podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be back. Should I give a little bit about Martian?
Yeah, tell us about like Martian, what you do, and how things are going.
Yeah. So Martian is a research lab focused on understanding intelligence. And what that means practically is, we are both studying the models in terms of building really good benchmarks, evals, trying to know what they actually do, and then trying to understand how they do it, so looking inside of them. And that's our focus. So I figure it jives well with the question of, hey, what do these open source models actually do well?
Yeah, and I think you have a really good insight on specific tasks as well, in which like these models are performing really well. And then Irfan is doing a ton of, you've done these before in previous jobs, a little bit of experimentation here at CodeRabbit as well with these tasks. So let's start with like the first things this week. I don't know if it was this week or last week, but we had Gemma 4 coming out last week. This week we have GLM 5.1 coming out. Really interesting approaches into how these models are being released. But jumping into that, like, what are your first impressions of what is happening with the open source models, and like, why should people really care about experimenting with them?
Yeah, I can start. So generally, there are several architectural changes typically from the new open source models, not Gemma particularly, but continuously the source models continue to become better, cheaper, and faster. So smaller models are capable of doing tasks that the previous generation of larger models used to be able to do. So there's this kind of march of open source models trying to catch up with frontier models. That continuously happens. Frontier models typically do better at a lot of things, but open source models continuously and rapidly improve. They're faster, they're cheap, and they have low latency, and you can self-host them, and some you can even run on your own machine. So very fast inference. Yeah.
I think another thing that's cool about open source models is they're much more customizable in the sense of you can actually look inside of them. You can say, let's fine tune this model. Let's do RL on this model. So you've also started to see this trend of companies, especially who are doing things at very large scale, taking these models and RLing them in order to improve performance.
Yeah, we heard the story. Probably this was 2 to 3 weeks ago of Cursor,
Yep.
Yeah.
who leaked that Kimi K2.5 was being used behind the scene of their model, and some licensing things seems to have happened there where they needed to share that they were using the model internally. And Lee Robb, amazing developer experience person at Cursor, came out and kind of hold the ground for Cursor, saying like, okay, we did this, we're gonna do it better next time, we appreciate all of you all. And I think it was very valuable for, I think overall, like, everyone that is starting to work with these open source models and starting to fine tune them to understand that, and something that we haven't talked about probably specifically with Gemma that was interesting as well, is like the licenses of these models, like the way that you can interact with this model. Gemma is the first one that got Apache 2.0. Interesting from Google to have more permissive type of like licenses. But moving into that realm, especially with fine tuning, and we can just like deviate there a little bit more. Do you think there's a future where companies are going to start using more open models and start to training them on their tasks, the work that they're doing, and try to make them more efficient to their specific use cases? Or where do you see kind of like this fine tuning going on in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's both like a practical answer today about, how fine tuning is going to evolve. But there's also a kind of longer term strategic question that I think a lot of companies have to grapple with, right? So in the more immediate term, if you have a lot of data, then that's a great way of improving your product. And one of the easiest ways, or if not easiest, then one of the more kind of fruitful ways of doing that is potentially to do things like RL or fine tuning. Right. And of course, this requires you to have a really good sense of what your data looks like, have enough of it to do this well. But I think that companies are going to, starting from like the largest folks, start doing this. And typically what the largest companies are doing today, other companies end up doing in the near future as the technology becomes easier. There's more open source technology, which makes it easier to do those kinds of things. There's also another interesting dynamic where not everyone is probably going to have access to all of the closed source models forever. right? Like you saw a kind of preview of this with the whole Claude Mythos thing, right? Where they said, we're not actually publicly releasing this Claude Mythos preview. You're just gonna have to take our word for it, and you can't use it yet. Only these 40 companies, right? And so if you're going to live in a world where you want to have the best capabilities, but you're not always going to have every single model available, then at some point you need to say, okay, well, actually these open source models matter a lot, so that you don't get like sort of cut off from the source of intelligence, right? So I think that's kind of two reasons why I think companies are going to adopt a lot more open source.
Yeah. And to your point, like with the DoD and Anthropic drama too, like if so all of a sudden, like you're working with an institution that bans like a specific suite of models, not just one model, then you would have to be able to find and quickly pivot to alternatives that are performant, but are also an equivalent in terms of what you are replacing. And so it's worthwhile investing in infrastructure, digital and physical infrastructure for companies to curate data that you can do preference optimization or RL for, and try to at least test open source models and see how far you can push them. I think the trade-offs and the long-term bet for that is probably worthwhile because at some point, like even if the frontier models like start to slow down in terms of capacity or capability, plateau, excuse me, open source models will eventually catch up. And perhaps you might see one day that an open source model with good preference optimization and post-training can be as good as frontier models on at least some specific tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've actually seen this in production today, right? Like we've had the cool opportunity to partner with folks who are doing a lot of traffic volume. And we can actually look at what kind of requests are going through those folks' traffic. Why is it that particular requests are being made, and also what kinds of models are actually capable of serving those requests. And even today, something like greater than 50% of the requests that we're seeing, obviously it'll differ very much by like application and things like that, but we're working with some fairly general purpose applications. Like more than 50% of those requests can already be served by open source models. Like in many ways, the capabilities are already there.
Yeah, and something that is, I think, something important that you mentioned, Arfan, is that these models, even if they're like open source, they're catching up with like closed source models or more like these like big model lab type of models. My question there is like, we got the DeepSeek moment like 2-3 years ago, where essentially like the AI stock market just like crashed and everyone was panicking. Where are we right now in terms of like that comparison? Because at that time, it was very clear that there was this opportunity for these models that were open source. People could run them on their own machines if you have like a massive machine or enough power for running those machines. But that tell us more about like where were we at that moment? Where are we now in terms of like open source models? There's more actors getting involved. Like where are we at in this whole like ecosystem of open source models, and who should we keep an eye on in the models that they're releasing?
Do you want to go for it? Should I? Or
I can take a stab. So I think there's a lot more variety in terms of models that are open source now compared to a few years ago. So even I think Allen AI released an Olmo model. And the thing is that releasing these models, what's best matters, but also like it's really good to learn from other people's experiences, because what's really happening is like there's a set of companies or institutions that are open sourcing models, but also writing up how they release them and how they trained them. And I think there's a lot of learning and scientific contributions in those write-ups that people would miss out on if they don't read them and just play with them. So I think there are two types of contributions. I think there's the scientific contribution, and there's like the capacity and capability contribution of like the models themselves. So I think both should be appreciated by the community, I think, and both have different values. And I think the other thing is that even big tech companies like Meta and Google have been part of the open source community, and they're releasing models, and NVIDIA as well. And I think beforehand, most of these labs or companies didn't open source anything. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah. I think Olmo is a really interesting one because they are open sourcing everything, like the training scripts and the data. I really like the folks at AI2 actually my and my co-founder's advisor in doing research in academia did a sabbatical at AI2, so I got
That's
to like
awesome.
meet a lot of the folks there. And they're really, really cool.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of increasing open sourcing of how these models are trained, definitely something to pay attention to. I think one other trend which is really interesting is that when companies kind of like start out, when like a new lab, it decides, okay, we're going to be a model lab, we're going to train LLMs. Oftentimes their earliest models are open source. So like this was the case for like OpenAI, for example. I remember when
Yes.
GPT-2 was open source.
Yeah.
Back then it was a big deal.
Yeah.
But also like this is kind of like how Mistral started out, or like all of the kind of Chinese labs who are kind of the leaders in open source today. They're also doing it for I think much the same reasons. It's a way of getting attention on the work that they're doing. And I think one thing we're going to see is that now there's like a new batch of labs that are spinning up in other countries as well, including in the US, right?
Mhm.
And so you're going to see more open source models in the US too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I do believe that there's a lot of value from having these open source models, but I think when people hear about open source models, think about it in the same way that they think about open source, where
Mhm.
you can just go to a website, download the thing, run on your computer. But with like these models, you need like really big hardware to run, like, I don't know, if you have like a 600 billion parameter model,
Mhm.
like I think like BDMax had like a model that size. You still need to have a computer or enough processing power to run these models. So even though like they're like open source, you still need some sort of hardware to run all of them. And I think that is a little bit of what you said was interesting, where it's a good distribution channel, but if you as an average user, you have your laptop, your phone, you still need one of these cloud providers to run any of these models. A little bit of what Irfan mentioned before on smaller models coming up, and I think probably we're going to start seeing more of these, where you're going to have smaller models running on your phones, running on your laptops. Uh, I think I would love to see a little bit more of that. Gemma particularly worked on that, and I think talking about, I don't know, Hendrik, if we can put the blog post here on the main screen. But we have like this blog post that is essentially a visual guide of how Gemma was built, and it's really interesting that a lab or like Google has this person that joined essentially like a month ago. His name is Martin Grotendorst. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. But he did like this beautiful blog post explaining the different architectures, because they have like a model specifically running for like mobile or phones. They have another architecture for running on laptops, and then they have, I think it's like the mixture of experts is run for like more
Yes.
capacity, bigger kind of models. They have feed forward neural networks for more like mobile devices. And just the ability, and I think the transparency, as you mentioned, of not only telling you, oh yeah, we have like this new model, it's open source, go use it, and then you're like completely unaware of how it works, what's happening behind the scenes, versus now where people are documenting the process and the thought process of these models is really valuable. And I don't know, personally, like I learn a lot from like this beautiful blog post on the architecture of Gemma. And with, I don't know, with everything that is going on right now in terms of like these models, do you believe that the idea here for open source the model beyond distribution channel, are you thinking that there's going to be a opportunity in the future where like people are going to be able to be more easily integrating these models into like their everyday devices, beyond having to like do a massive hyperscaler to run any of these models locally? Like
It's kind of it's kind of like in the history of evolution, it's not like you only got one size of intelligence, right? Like humans are probably the most prolific form of intelligence, and probably we'll continue to have huge data centers running very large models is like one of the main ways in which people are using these things, right? Because I think that making the models bigger does typically make them more capable, but at the same time, there's plenty of niches in every ecosystem where like all sorts of other intelligence exists, right? Like you have like octopi, which have a totally different architecture than humans, right? And ants, which are again, a totally different architecture of intelligence than humans. And those are very successful species. I think like ants are probably the single species with like the most biomass on Earth amongst like the animal kingdom, right? So like there's a lot of ants going and doing their ant compute, you know? And like we're probably going to see the same kind of proliferation of AI into different niches as well, because it's the same dynamic of like there's different like competitive pressures in each space, different constraints. And like as engineers, a big part of an engineer's job in building, you know, around these sorts of things is figuring out what kinds of constraints they have, what kind of architectures to use.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we're just, you know, intelligently designing this ecosystem instead of kind of having it evolve.
Yeah, I cannot wait until we get like an infographic of like which model is which animal at some point. But the other part is what you mentioned, right? Like they're built for specific tasks. Like whenever both of you are like we're doing either like today or before like benchmarks and testing these models, what are you looking for? Like how do you know? Because one of the things that I get a lot from social media is I think the teams already know how to set up like this motion of like a new release. There's like campaigns. There's a ton of stuff that happens whenever someone releases a new model beyond just the hey, here's my thing, just go and check it out. That can add a little bit more noise, and then we also have a very hype type of culture in AI, which sometimes can be a little bit hard to filter out. But my question is, I think like both of you have really in-depth experience with these models. What do you look for, and how do you know like, oh, this model is good or is better? Like, tell us more about like this process for you to test out these models.
Yeah, I mean, probably Irfan, you're you know serving a very specific kind of set of use cases. You can give the specific advice, and I'll give the more general one.
Oh, sure. I think the main thing is that you would want to know what the end goal is. So what are you trying to optimize for? What does the end user, how will the end user use the model? And what kind of capabilities do you want the model to use? So we start with that big question, and then there are different types of benchmarkings that you can do. So we see like, oh, everybody's benchmarking on like Sweetbench Verified, Sweetbench Pro, and so on. So these are existing offline benchmarks that are pre-curated, that you can really compare apple to apple. It's the same task definition, properly vetted, and then the same different models with different configurations are run on the same task, and then you compute how well it does, right? So, but it's a very specific tasks. And then how do you measure general intelligence currently is that you multiply this across many different benchmarks on many different well-specified tasks, hundreds, if not thousands, right? And each benchmark has thousands of samples. And that's how you aggregate the scores from all of them, and then you get your ranking of how well does this model compare to another one. Another way of doing it is that you give the output of a model to a human, and then another output of a model to a human, and you do like similar to A/B testing, and you ask the human which output do you prefer, which is more correct. And the human gets some guidelines if the task permits it. But sometimes it's just like a preference. Do you prefer this over this? And then you get an ELO system.
Yeah.
So those are two main ways of measuring and benchmarking systems on a general scheme. The more specific thing for code, for software engineering tasks, it depends on what you want the model to do. So if you want the code model to generate really good code, you would want to give it you would want to measure it in benchmarks that are like Sweetbench Pro and Sweetbench Verified. And there are previous benchmarks that in my opinion, are outdated now, like Human Eval. They're saturated. You can see models that do like 99% on them. And the reason is probably because of training contamination. These benchmarks have been around for 5 years now. I think 2021 was when it was released. And then so when you scrape GitHub to pre-train your model has probably seen these tasks, this benchmark in its training data set. So since none of these models open source, they're pre-trained in Corpora, it's very difficult to see if there's any training contamination that's happening. So that's a different that's a different tangent. But yeah, I think generally you would want to gauge how well the model does also subjectively. You would qualitatively evaluate it you would behave as the user would, and you would qualitatively analyze how it behaves and whether it's aligned with what you want or not, and then refine from there.
So I think you mentioned a lot of really interesting things. I'm gonna like pull out these pieces and then try to generalize them a little bit, right? I think one thing you said that was really interesting is you kind of have to have a benchmark that's specific to your task. And then when you're measuring kind of like general capabilities, what you'll do is you'll take a whole bunch of these, 100,000 of these, and then you'll see, okay, across all of these, how does it actually perform? And I think this actually gets at a really deep point about like these models and like about the nature of intelligence too, which is that like general intelligence doesn't really exist, right? You really have a whole bunch of specialized intelligences with some correlation between them,
Mhm.
right? And so even if you think of models getting generally more capable, they're going to get capable in this like very jagged way, right? Where it's not going to be like, oh, it's very smoothly getting more capable at everything. It's actually like, oh, the model got more capable at the things we trained the model to do,
Mhm.
right? And you're not going to see like this crazy out of domain generalization, so to speak, right? And so this has a couple of kind of like concrete impacts if you're a practitioner, right? Like the first is this impact of you have to really know what you're trying to measure in order to make your application better. And if you're just starting out and building your application, maybe it's like vibe checks, right?
Mhm.
But over time, it needs to develop into much more sophisticated evaluations, right?
Yes.
And those evaluations have to correlate with the thing you actually care about. Because even though there's like general correlation between task performance, there's a lot of variance in any given specific task,
Mhm.
right? So like if you have real user data, that's a single best thing for measuring whether your model is good at the particular task, right? Is like, does it actually make the experience of users better, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of like a very underrated lesson. I think that very few people like actually do benchmarking and evals correctly, but it's hard. Like it takes a lot of like thinking to do that really carefully, right? And so I think that really, there's probably tons of places where open source models are actually better than their closed source counterparts. But it's a question of, can you actually measure that well enough, right?
Mhm.
And so I think measurement is this really, really critical question, and really thinking hard about what is it you care about and validating that against users, not just like doing vibes stuff is really important. There's a great blog post by Andrej Karpathy from many years back in 2019, where he basically says like, how do you debug an ML problem, or how do you tackle an ML problem? And the first piece of advice that he gives is to become one with your data, right? Because just like actually looking at the data and understanding like what the task is and like what is specialized in that domain, right?
Mhm.
Matters so much. Like don't just treat these models as if there's only one number called intelligence and it goes up. Like no, there's a lot of different things. You need to measure your specific thing,
Mhm.
right? And this actually gets to a second point I found really interesting in your answer around these benchmarks, right? And you're like, oh, some of these benchmarks are old and they're outdated, and so you can't really use them anymore, right? And I think there's a really fundamental reason why this happens, which is that we want to measure like the capabilities of the model. And any given benchmark is only like locally correlated with capabilities.
Yes.
Right? It's not globally correlated with capabilities because these global correlations like are very rare. They don't actually seem to exist, right? And so because of that, when you optimize against that, and people basically are like benchmaxing, or they're unintentionally benchmaxing, or they're like, oh, I see what kind of data is here. Let me go and get the guys at Mercor to give me some more data, which looks kind of like that, right? The guys at Snorkel or whatever, Scale AI, right? And then unintentionally you end up fitting to the kinds of tasks which are most visible, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this thing called Goodhart's law, right? Which is when you start treating something as a goal instead of merely a measurement, it ceases to be a good measurement, right?
Mm.
Because any degree to which you're not perfectly correlated also gets exploited.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're doing things which like the benchmark tells you to do, but actually, really getting better at the task wouldn't tell you to do. Right. And this happens all the time with benchmarks, right? Which is why benchmarking isn't like a one-time thing. It's like an ongoing process where you have to like continuously make sure that you're aligned with what your users really care about. I think those were like two of the fundamental kind of pieces I pulled out of what you were saying, because I thought you had a really good answer.
Yeah, this is awesome.
It's like in Farshape, they always make this joke about like some models being like the "trust me, bro" bench. It's like, yeah, this is our new thing. This is like the best. We did our own benchmark, and we're like the number one.
Oh yeah.
Benchmark kidding.
Benchmarking, yeah. But I think you mentioned something important, which is the real world usage, right? And I think this is one of those pieces that has a lot of kind of like it gets a little bit combative in social media, where like you do have these models and the benchmark, either like you have it naturally or you benchmarked. But then like online, you see a lot of discussion of like who's the best model.
Yeah.
And something that like in previous like experiences I had is real world data is so valuable for really understanding how these models are performing and how people are taking it. But I don't think a lot of, let's go like agents, for example, share how these models are performing. In some previous jobs, like we would share the approval rates of each of the models, trying to showcase which ones were not only what the most popular model, and at the time was like work code fast because it was cheap and like it was free. One of the coolest things that like I think any company has done is like work code fast. I think enable a lot of people to really get started with with models overall, like with AI, just because it was free, so people could feel less of a pressure of this is going to be an expensive trial.
Yeah.
But at the same time, being able to collect the data and saying like, even if this is the most popular model, we are seeing these other models being the ones that have the most approval for coding tasks was really relevant for both our users and also for these model labs to be able to do different arrangements with their models. Definitely, we need more transparency on not only the benchmarks once it is released, but like the follow-ups. I think they don't get as much like visibility, probably because it's not a marketing moment.
Yeah.
As whenever you're releasing like a new model, when you want to showcase like all of the improvements and how cool your model is compared to previous iterations. So in that sense, when you are, I don't know, you're doing all of these measure pieces at Martian, but do you do these follow-ups as well on like how people are interacting with the models, or where does that,
Yeah.
how does that look like?
So we try to keep our benchmarks regularly up to date. So we try to push kind of bi-weekly updates to make sure that, you know, the data remains relevant, things continue to work well. One thing that we actually think about a lot is this question of, you know, what could you do if you really take benchmarking seriously, right? So, you know, if you look at the cost of training these models, like the largest models cost billions of dollars to train, but the largest data sets are probably like thousands of dollars, right? like it's not like you have benchmarks that people are spending billions of dollars on, right? And so like there's almost this like gap between like what we're building and how we're actually measuring it, right? And so we just know way less about these models than we should. And part of where I think those resources should go in if you're going to make like $1 billion benchmarks is in making sure you have these kinds of continuous updates, that you're like, you know, really trying to learn about these models. And it'll lead to a very different kind of type of benchmark, because you almost want to like actively fight Goodharting, right? So you're going to have like consistent updates. You have to really think through like, what are you measuring? And I think there's a lot of cool stuff you learn while doing that.
Yeah. Is that why you have the online like benchmarks and the offline benchmarks? For example, we were taking a look at the code review bench, which is kind of like a good kind of like North Star for us to know how we're performing. And probably like Irfan can tell us more about like how we look into it. I love the April Fool joke, by the way, the fighting benchmark or something.
Fighting,
I love that we can bring knives to benchmarking. But so is this kind of like the reason why you have the online bench versus the offline bench? Or tell us a little bit more of the philosophy, and then probably we can hear from Irfan, like how does this like impact your work?
That's exactly the reason why, right? I think there are a lot of people, they look at benchmarks and they say, well, okay, like it's a benchmark, but a lot of people are doing bench marketing or bench maxing, and so like I don't really trust it, right? And the thing that's much more reliable is if you have some kind of tracker where you can say in the real world, here's how people actually use these things, right? And these kinds of trackers, I think people have a lot more faith in, because it's, you know, people basically putting their money where their mouth is, right? And so if you look at this kind of like online tracker, you can then ask the question, okay, so why are people putting their money in this particular way? Right? Why do people use these tools in this specific way? And if you build a benchmark around that and you make sure that these two things are causally related, like the things that cause people to use particular models more are reflected in the offline benchmark, that's how you can make your benchmark actually good. And those things will change over time. So your benchmark also has to change over time. And that's exactly what we tried to do with this, you know, code review bench piece. And I guess like tying this back to kind of the original topic of open source models, right? I think one of the things that's really cool is if you can measure the performance of these models as it relates to what people actually care about, right? Then you can see, okay, where should people actually be using these models?
Mhm.
Right? And I don't know, hopefully that kind of thing also makes your guys' work easier.
Yeah, I think the fundamental goal of benchmarking is that we're trying to measure how well a model does on a specific task, which is a proxy to its capacity to do basically it should correlate with how a human would use this product or how it would perform in real world settings or another more general environment. That's really the fundamental goal of a benchmark.
Mhm.
It's a static snapshot in time where you would use that data to measure the capacity or capability of a model that would hopefully generalize to an unseen environment or unseen set of tasks that are similar to the benchmark.
Mhm.
Now, one thing I've seen is that one thing that's really important about building benchmarks in and of its own is that it needs to be reproducible, the process needs to be rigorous, and the task needs to be very well defined. So those are really fundamental criteria that, like in the academic community, that's something that's very heavily emphasized. So things like inter-annotator agreement. Multiple humans can agree on what is correct versus incorrect for this task. And I think that yeah, benchmarks like that are produced should be rigorous for them to be trusted. And so, yeah, but going to back an earlier question, how does this impact the work? So, by using benchmarks that are produced, we can learn about the strengths and weaknesses of our system.
Mhm.
And kind of continuously try to iterate and improve it. Okay, so it doesn't do well on this. Let me do root cause analysis. Let me see why did our system fail to respond or pick up this issue or comment on this feature or this bug, right? And then, okay, well, it didn't pull this necessary context from here. Why did that happen? And then I can go and reverse engineer and improve the system and push a feature. So
Mhm.
that's how it impacts the engineer who's working on improving the product. And it's a very, very helpful tool, per se, that serves a specific purpose of continuous improvement. Now, this process can be automated as well. So things, I think there is, but before we do that, to your point of Andrej Karapathy's article, I think fundamentally everybody now is becoming like a machine learning engineer in a way.
Yep.
So a lot of machine learning principles that we've been doing before it was cool required you to have sufficient domain expertise in how your machine learning model benchmarking, looking at the data, doing error analysis and continuously improving, training changing parameters and so on. But now basically the machine learning model is an API call.
Yeah.
So anybody could use this machine learning model that can predict all sorts of things and do all sorts of tasks, which is really, really cool. And I think there's a saying, I forgot who said it, but I think if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And you apply that to benchmarks. You really sit down, you understand the task really well, you understand the strengths and failures of your system, and then you continuously refine and iterate.
Mhm.
And that process can be automated. I think one of the really cool things, I think Andrej Karapathy did this auto research project, if you've heard of it, where he tries to automate this very process of like, okay, how far can I get with automating refinement of a machine learning model on a set of tasks or specific tasks? And it turns out you can do that. It will cost more. You have to run it overnight and things like that. But really genuinely, like having general intelligence or like intelligence that's capable of doing many things unlocks all sorts of possibilities for automation that
Mhm.
we've never thought were possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's really exciting.
So I wanna go back into open source models.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we could talk about benchmarks for days, but one of the cool comments that I overheard this in San Francisco type of moment was that, and I love this idea of like benchmarks and benchmarking because I think marketing and AI is just like coming together a lot lately. A friend went to NeurIPS this last year, and they were complaining that there was so many marketing teams at like a scientific academic conference. But going back to open source models, I think there's we've talked about like benchmarking, how it works. One of the things that it's kind of interesting that I found is not only the explicit behaviors, but also the implicit behaviors of these models. And with user testing, and the more that you get to use these models, you identify kind of like tasks or things that they perform well. A good example of that is like Kimi-K 2.5. People found out that it was really good for UI type of tasks and started to use a lot for that. And the other piece that I think it is important to mention is that unfortunately there's a lot of geopolitics in the open source models world as well. When you have China fighting with like the US, Europe. I think my perception is that it's trying to catch up with what's happening, but it's a little bit harder to like rights. People have human rights in Europe. But essentially what I would love to discuss more about is like, let's talk about these geopolitics of these models. And from what I hear from a lot of enterprise or like customers is that they are concerned about using Chinese models because they have like this notion of my data, and then a lot of companies in the US, they have some sort of compliance things that prevent them from using these type of technologies. Where are we going with like this whole geopolitics on these models? Let's talk about a little bit of like what's happening in China, the US, Europe, which I would say are the primary markets where we're seeing the development of these open source models. And then I don't know if you have like any takes of, like is the US catching up with China in open source? What should like the US be focusing on Europe as well?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
You'll have more than me. So go ahead.
I personally am quite bullish on American open source models, right? I think we already have some open source models that are doing very cool things. So like obviously AI2 has Olmo, and I think that's very cool as a scientific endeavor. And I think similarly, NVIDIA has Nemotron, right?
Mhm.
And with Nemotron, I mean, they're also going and open sourcing all of the kind of infra around the model. Another thing which I think is great for science and engineering. These models are also surprisingly capable, right? Like I think mostly hear about kind of the Chinese open source models, but like Nemotron is, I think, way better at tool calling than previous kind of generations of open source models in the US.
I did
right?
see a couple of tweets yesterday about it. I was like very surprised. Yeah.
And I think that there's like other companies like Reflection, for example, which are also in the process of building more open source models in the US, which I think will probably lead to some cool stuff,
Mhm.
right? I think that on the flip side of this, especially being someone who has kind of like a background in science, like I do kind of believe that science is like an international endeavor,
Yeah.
right? And like it's great when we can have scientific advances kind of independent of where they come from. So I think there's a lot of things which are awesome about other countries also helping to build out kind of the science around these things. In terms of, for example, like the Chinese models, I think there are a lot of things these models are actually really good at, and in production. I'm not saying that you should like run these models on like a Chinese server somewhere. That's maybe a little bit more suspect. But like if you run them on a server like in the US, right, or in some other part of the world where you're serving your customers, I think it's actually very low risk to be running these sorts of models today, right? So I think we can already see a lot of these things in production. I mean, we personally at Martian use some of these models in production, obviously hosted in the US.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts. So, in terms of security, I think one of the primary concerns of using Chinese models is that they can have sort of the notion of a backdoor where they could do like, who knows if they corrupted the weights to do certain things. So
Yeah.
if a person with a specific prompt injection, a Chinese person or something with an adversary, right, is able to go into your product, know that that you're using their model, and then like prompt inject using a specific prompt injection that would go and turn off your system, or that would be cyber attacked. So I think that's one of the primary concerns of using non-US models in US infrastructure, especially at the government. So things like.
So can I interrupt you briefly there?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I'll mention 2 points around this. Actually, not so brief interruption. So feel free to interrupt me back.
Sure. Sure.
I think there's kind of 2 points around this backdoors idea, right? One is today, with the way that models perform and the way that you're able to jailbreak them, you don't need to be like a foreign adversary to like jailbreak the model, right? Like people are using Chipotle support bot to like do their math homework and all sorts of stuff, right? Like I don't think that it's like substantially more risky in reality to use these open source models, right? In part because there are still like open questions about how do you secure the models themselves.
Yeah.
And so like the right thing to do, I think, is not secure the models, or I mean, I think in the long term we should do more of that. I think it's actually a very important part of AI safety. But a lot of it has to come down to securing the harness around your model, right? This is where like permissioning and a lot of these kinds of things matter a lot.
Yes.
Right. And I think the second thing I'll say around this point is there's actually research now developing techniques for detecting these kinds of backdoors, right? There's actually great work, I think, from some of the researchers at Martian who've tackled these kinds of problems in terms of some of the fundamental work on backdoors. There's a great paper, I think, from Philip Isola's lab at MIT, where they come up with this idea of kind of a Platonic representation hypothesis, which is that if you train two models on similar data, they'll have a very similar way of representing the world internally,
Yes.
right? And so to the degree that you can access the internals of these models, and guess what, with open source models you can. In fact, it's only closed source models where you can't.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Right?
That
You
is
can
correct.
actually start diffing between models and ask, okay, what is similar here and what isn't.
Mm.
And if there is, like some kind of backdoor embedded in the models, I think that we'll be able to detect them, especially with models that are open source.
Yeah.
Right? Now, of course, that's still research, and I don't think anyone's really productionized that fully yet.
Mm.
But today, I don't think we have to worry about it because all models can be jailbroken, and you really should be building the
Yes.
harness carefully.
Yes.
And in the future, I think this will be a problem which research solves more thoroughly in terms
Yeah.
of model diffing.
I think the piece that you're talking about is interesting in terms of the now new theme called inference engineering, which has
Yeah.
to do with where you're running this model, right? And I think there's like, from what I've worked with other customers, is like 3 different ways. You can have the public cloud, your Anthropic, your CAI subscription. You can have your private cloud, having it somewhere like in an instance, probably owned. You can have self-hosted or air-gapped environments as well, which I would love to know more about the, how can people use like open source models? Like, where are you running these models, and what are your recommendations for someone that wants to start experimenting with local models in their own machines or locally?
Yeah. So I think the easiest thing to do is honestly, a lot of these open source models are like free in certain products, right? Like I know, for example, like Minimax's models, like M2.5, I think are just like free in kilocode or things like that. So just like try them first. Right? I think it's a good way to get started,
Yeah.
honestly. And then after that, you can explore a lot more thoroughly, right? So I think there's a lot of inference providers out there, Together, Base 10, who offer these models, right? And with some of these models, there's ways of getting them running locally, right? And there's a lot of resources on this online. It's the kind of thing where if you go to Google or you ask your friendly neighborhood language model, like it can guide you through a lot of it,
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think NVIDIA, part of the NVIDIA like software that downloads your GPU software has like an AI chatbot thing that you can download a model and like interact with it, one of the NVIDIA models or any open source model, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of, because I was doing these a lot for like coding agents. Big fan of Ollama and LM Studio, depending what you like. Kind of like providing a really good OpenAI compatible like endpoint for you to connect these models back into everything. So I personally, unfortunately, you need a lot of RAM, and RAM, we know it's kind of expensive right now.
Yeah.
Luckily enough, like if you have, I don't know, if it's like a 30 billion parameter, probably you can do it well with beyond 30, 40 gigabytes of RAM. Probably you can run it. I would say if you want more commercial grade type of models locally, you need at least like 120 billion parameters to have something runnable.
It depends on how fast you want it to run. Right? Like in theory, swap memory exists. It's just very slow.
Yeah. And also context length. How much context are you going to put in the model?
But overall, I think that there's, which is going back to like the Gemma conversation, being able to have these different quantized versions or different versions of the model really help out for more people to be able to run them in whatever machines they have.
Yes.
And experiment with them, which I think one of the biggest pieces that, as you mentioned, for understanding which model you want to use is just being able to try it out.
Yep.
I personally think that that is the only way that you can really make the most out of it. So just going through like a real overview of like open source models, which are your like the open source models you're keeping an eye on in terms of what they're doing, what are you interested in seeing more from, what are some models that you would keep an eye on if you were thinking of using some of these models?
I'm really excited about seeing what Reflection cooks up, and the whole like America doing open source kind of vein of things. So it's probably my number one pick right now. I don't know if Juan, you have a different opinion, or Fawn.
Honestly, I'm interested in like how the open source. There has been very little innovation in terms of the language model architecture,
Mhm.
and I think I'm really interested in like what kind of optimizations the open source community will do in terms of making the language models faster, in terms of inference, use less memory, or capability, but something other than just decoder. Just decoder only, and token by token prediction. I think the last one I've seen was like MLA, multi-head latent attention. That was a pretty
Mhm.
cool idea, where the KV cache is like put into the latent space. So that consumes a lot less memory. Yeah, in terms of what language model specifically or open source, I would say like I would try out like things that seem to be really good on benchmarks first. Like I would probably try out Gemma, or something that's really easily accessible. Like I could just download it really quickly, or it's available on a website, and I can just like go on my phone and like just send it
Mhm.
something really silly and see how it reacts, right?
Mhm.
So I think accessibility is very important for open source models, and I think they need to be very easily accessible. And the easier for me to access it, the more likely I am to try it.
Yeah, 100%. Being able to easily set up the model impacts a lot, and that's why I think Llama NLab Studio became such an important distribution channel as well. It's just like you just install the thing, run it, download the model, and it's running on its own. I think for me, like from more of a consumer point of view, I was very, very impressed with the first iterations of Minimax.
Mhm.
Their team is, I know their team, they're super nice people. And I know they're doing like a lot of work to improve the model. GLM 5.1 that came up last morning, like yesterday morning. I haven't played with it a lot, but GLM has always been this model that kind of like is catching up with Opus, whatever version it has. And they have really good benchmarks. Running it is a little bit hard from my experience.
Mhm.
And more on the western side of the world, I do like the mysticism around reflection.
Yeah.
I think everyone is very, very excited to see what comes out, which hopefully we don't pressure them to spend extra time just trying to meet the bar.
Mhm.
I had a really good conversation with the Trinity team with RC. They're also based here in San Francisco. They're also catching up. I love their models, and I think maybe the last one that I can think of is there's these weird models that are coming out. Like TikTok is
Mhm.
starting to do their own. Xiaomi is starting their own.
Yeah.
And my question there for open source would be being able to not have this reliance on like these three regions. Like I know Chile is working on their own model as well. Mexico published like their Mexico model
Mhm.
that has like a super small context window. And I think countries need to start thinking as well if they have the talent locally to
Yeah.
build these models, because it's going to help them out not to become dependent on any other country to get access to intelligence.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the US drags a lot of the talent from these other places and brings them to the US.
Mm.
But I do believe there's need to start working on more local models that are aligned to what people in these different regions are looking for.
Yeah, I think there's also the UAE. They also released a model a couple years back, a bunch of models actually. And I think the main thing that is that I guess most of the models that are currently being produced by most of the AI labs are already multilingual. So they
Mhm.
already support like 100+ languages, even dialects. Like the first time I spoke, I think GPT-4o or GPT-4 was multilingual. I spoke to it in a dialect in Arabic, and it was able to respond really well. And I was like, "Whoa, this is cool." Beforehand, you needed like a specialized model.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, so I think there's less of an incentive if the AI labs continue to produce like frontier models that are capable in many different languages and dialects for
Mhm.
other countries to kind of train their own models, because it's so resource intensive and there's a war for talent too. But I think it would be pretty cool. And then there have been initiatives from multiple countries, Mexico, UAE, and so on, to produce local models that can be
Mhm.
run locally or produced by the nation or the government itself.
We talked about all these different ways that people can start learning more about models. We talked about the benchmarks. Also like a lot model cards whenever they publish them. I love Anthropic. I love and hate Anthropic because they have like these 120 pages model cards, and I
Yeah.
wish more open source models would do that so that you can really get in depth into it. But as a normal user or someone who's exploring open source models, where do you hear or is there any place where you get all of these news about like the models coming out or the benchmarks or comparisons between models?
It's a good question. I don't know if I'm super well equipped to answer it. I think because we're a research lab, we also just like know people at all the other research labs. So like that's probably the best way. Sometimes you get the news before it's public. You know?
Yeah. Move to San Francisco.
But I think honestly, probably finding the people in the space who are doing interesting things, who are building, who are kind of like serious about evals. I think those kinds of people are probably going to give you a good sense of things. Yeah.
I can answer it as well. When my time in academia, I wasn't very well connected with industry, so I follow certain influencers on like LinkedIn or Twitter who continuously like try and create content about new models, kind of like what we are here today. And so when you follow them, you kind of get to get the news when it comes out, and then I get to try it out. I can figure out how to try it out and try it out. But generally, like there's this network effect. If you follow like certain people or certain influencers whose like primary purpose is to communicate all the latest news about AI models or open source models, then I would give them a follow.
Yeah, and make sure they are independent sources. But okay,
I think we're pretty independent.
we're very independent right now.
Good plug. Good local plug.
Last question, and then we can do through some like rapid fire questions. Is what is a model you would tell a friend to try out?
I honestly think that Minimax has made a good job of having easy kind of like free endpoints for people to go and play around with their models. So just like whatever's lowest friction is probably the best to get started with these models if you haven't played around with them before. In that sense, I think just figuring out an IDE that has free access to one of these models, like I think Minimax and Kilo, for example, and then go play with it. Yeah.
I don't have a specific. play with NVIDIA and Gemma 4.
Yeah, I think Neutron is very, very interesting, and it's an underhyped model.
Yeah.
If there's a company that can do something really cool, I think it's NVIDIA.
Yeah, the one making all the GPUs seems like a pretty good bet.
I think they're underperforming in terms of we know they could do something really cool because they have all of the resources, but at the same time, I understand the play.
Yeah, and I would highlight that it's impressive how far like the open source models have come without any like changes to the models themselves, just through post training. Like better training data really yields better models. And that's a pretty cool thing that the big companies can do really well.
Perfect. So let's start wrapping it up. We've been hearing a lot about new versions of DeepSeek coming up soon. Do you expect we're going to have another DeepSeek moment where everything is going to be broken apart and we will have to rethink about open source models when they release the next generation?
I think it's difficult for us to see. I think DeepSeek, like the reason why DeepSeek got so popular is because like it was comparable with GPT-4 or something at the time, right? So, but I think really is the bet going to if it's going to get really hyped up, it would have to be that an open source model is either comparable or better than a frontier model, which I think I'm not sure that's likely to happen, but I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I think the part of the reason that the DeepSeek moment happened is people were like, "Whoa, they trained on so little compute." And then NVIDIA's stock crashed, right? And like, even people who are outside of the AI bubble are like very aware of NVIDIA. It's probably a decent part of their portfolio at this point.
Yeah.
So like, that's the kind of thing which I think really shook people and made a lot of noise. It's hard to see what exactly would cause that again, right? So like my expectation is probably we're not going to have as big of a moment. Although I would love to see that, honestly, if something really shakes up the scene. And I think that the distribution that we're pulling from here is very long tailed, and the tails are very thick. So there's all sorts of events, which is very hard to predict.
Yes.
Mhm.
that's right.
I don't think it necessarily has to be like better than the kind of closed source models at everything, though.
Mm.
It just needs to be better at some subset that matters to people, right? And if they
Mm.
could pull that off, I think that would be pretty big.
Oh, I think if we frame it that way, that's interesting because I think what eventually the frontier models are going to solve problems that most people don't care about.
Mhm.
Just because like the level of intelligence that it requires, for example, to do like automated scientific research,
Yeah.
that requires so much more capability and capacity
Yep.
than the average person would use a language model for. It's like how do I cook a chicken? And I think like how do I cook a chicken is already like most open source models can respond to that. So I think, like you said earlier, like most use cases can be addressed with open source models, but really frontier intelligence is going to become more narrow and more specialized, and they won't be used for everything. So
Yeah. I think we'll see like a Cambrian explosion of different models, right?
Yeah.
And people will use models that are different for all sorts of different things.
yeah,
Yeah, that'd be actually pretty cool if we could have more specialized models for agriculture, for like different ecosystems. That'd be super, super interesting to see more of.
biology, AlphaFold.
But
Yeah, well-
even for like grepping across a code base, right? Like I feel like there's
Yeah.
a huge niche which like is currently underserved. I don't need Opus to like grep my code base, right? Like
Mhm,
Yes, you're right.
um,
yeah.
what is the most overrated and underrated thing in AI right now?
Can I put Anthropic for both?
Tell us. I'll allow it, but you need to tell us why.
Yeah, it's a good question. I just thought there was a funny answer. It wasn't a real answer. I'm excited to see what like Meta Superintelligence Labs does. Right, I feel like
Mhm.
they've been kind of quiet and kind of working away at things. So probably they're one of the most underrated right now because I don't think that they've made as much like the splashy headlines.
Mm.
But they are like a very well-funded organization with smart people.
Mhm.
In terms of overrated, honestly, I feel like AI is very highly rated, but kind of adequately rated because I think it is just going to be like so transformative. So it's something where maybe I'm biased, but I think if things are overrated, like only in Silicon Valley could they possibly be overrated. Like everywhere else is underrating it.
Mhm, mhm.
I think overrated. I think perhaps it's a difficult question to answer. I think people get excited way too easily. We do live in a hype culture. So I think a lot of things in essence are specific things are overrated. Like new model releases, I think are overrated. But I think generally the trend on a macro scale is super bullish. I'm super bullish on it because the capabilities, like compared to 2 years ago, 4 years ago, like you can really see the impact of the work that we are doing, that everybody else is doing, adopting these models and making them and transforming entire industries
Mhm.
overnight.
Mhm.
It's truly astounding. But you don't get to see that with one model release. You get to see that, across a year or across several months, where a lot of deep work happens after a model release. And there are a lot of detail. The devil is in the details.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of hype on splashy things and not enough hype or focus on details. And I think details matter in this industry. The underrated thing is, I think, I would say the details. I would guess like more specifically, I think fundamental questions on like how do we benchmark well, how do we evaluate models, how do we build design infrastructure. I think design is going to become more increasingly important in our age. Like how do you design and how do you design digital infrastructure? How do you design your system? How do you build the harness to
Mhm.
protect your system from exploits? These are questions that matter a lot that there's not enough focus on, and I think that's very underrated.
Totally. I won't tell mine though. I'm the host. I think any so we're into the last few minutes of the conversation, but anything you would like people to take away from what's happening with open source models and they should take action afterwards? Like, what is something someone who is watching should take a look at after watching this episode?
One of my favorite blog posts is a blog post titled "Reality has a Surprising Level of Detail." And it's not directly related to LLMs. It's about building a staircase. And it's like, it's so hard to build a staircase. You think it's easy, but like there's so much detail, right? I feel like AI is the same way. Like there's so many things that you can dig into, which are actually going to have a really interesting impact in the years to come. And the only way to really learn those things is, just like the only way to really understand how to build a staircase is to build one, right? The only way to really understand like open source models is to go and try playing around with them and to build things with it. So I think that's the biggest takeaway is like you should probably be looking at these models, using them.
Yeah, I think in an age where LLMs can do things for us, I think proactivity matters a lot. So yeah, try things, do them. I think that's the main takeaway. But I think it's going to become more increasingly difficult to be proactive when more of our life becomes automated. And I think that's something that I think about every day is like, am I becoming less proactive when I'm automating more of the things that I do, or my life becomes easier because of automation? This is a more philosophical question. Yeah, main takeaway is that try things, and I think really pay attention to how it's behaving and really think about what you want from the model and try to be as specific as possible when you interact with it.
Yeah, totally. And I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways that we had last year was that don't only rely on a single model provider.
Yes.
Different providers have different quality for each of these models based on how many people are doing like requests, how much they want to save in processing your model. So if you have a bad experience with one of these open source models, sometimes it's not because the model is not performing properly, but it's a quantized model or a provider is not supplying like a quality model. So try out if you have a bad experience with one model somewhere, try it out with another provider, see how it performs, and then verify if it correlates to the previous experience, so that you can get the most value and quality model out of these providers. Well, thank you so much, Yash and Arfan, for spending this time with us. Check out Martian for benchmarks. Check out CodeRabbit for code reviews. And we hope to see you all in the next live stream. This podcast is going to be available in the next few weeks. And let us know what are some other topics, things you would like to hear from our guest speakers in the future. Hopefully we didn't deviate it too much.
Only a little bit of philosophy.
But looking forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you for joining. It's like, are we muted?